Hi there.
Oh, yeah. Way back. That's been a long time. High school back.
All right, welcome to our session. Welcome to Growing Farm Businesses and Communities. My name is Jeremy Foltz. I'm a professor of agricultural and applied economics here at UW-Madison. And I'm going to be monitoring this? Is that what we're calling it? Moderating. Moderating.
Not monitoring.
No, I'm not monitoring anything. With Chuck Nicholson, who I think gets an introduction later. But
to introduce myself. So we thought about doing this Saturday Night Live thing where one of us was Michael Che and the other was Colin Jost, but we couldn't figure out which one was which. So, people can probably hear me. So, we're happy you're here. You've noted that we have some very spacious accommodations, lots of room to spread out in this room compared to the session this morning that was in here. So you're welcome for that. I'm going to turn it back over to Jeremy to get things started.
all right, so we've got 4 presentations, and then Chuck will finish up with a few thoughts, and then there'll be time for questions during each presentation, and time at the end. The presentations will be about 25 minutes, and we'll take questions after each speaker, and then again from all of us at the end. And so with that, let me introduce our first speaker, who is Claudine Pied, who's an associate professor of sociology and anthropology at UW-Platteville. Her research interests include rural politics and economic change and land ownership across the U.S. So please welcome Claudine.
Hello. All right, good. All right. Okay, there we are. So I am Claudine Pied, and you'll see up there as well Shan Sappleton, who has worked with me on this project. She's now in Ghana on sabbatical, so we don't get to see her today, but she and I have worked as a team on this project. So we started out a couple years ago with this really broad research question: how have changes in agricultural land affected the dairy industry and communities in southern Wisconsin? We're especially interested in terms of the land changes related to farm consolidation and residential development. So those are things we paid a particular attention to. And I do have too much to say here, so I'm probably going to whip through some slides or speak a little too quickly, so you'll have to come back to some questions a little later. So as you'll see, this project was started in 2020, 2022, and we have both a qualitative and a quantitative component to it. With the qualitative component, we did in-depth, semi-structured interviews. Semi-structured just means that we can ask lots of follow-up questions and talk about the things that people are interested in following up on. We talked to 55 different people, and it was about an hour or two, and you'll see from the list there that we didn't just speak with dairy farmers, but other people who are interested and somehow connected to the dairy industry. And then the second phase was a survey. You'll see it was an intensive survey, 57 questions, and we got 398 people to spend some time answering all of those questions. So some of the survey was through mail to dairy producers in 4 counties, and it was also distributed online as well. And this gives you, I'll talk a little bit about who we heard from with the survey. I will bring in a little bit more of the survey because I haven't talked too much about that yet. I've talked a little bit more about the interviews in the past. So you'll see here the connections to agriculture of the people who answered the survey. So the majority were farmers and farmland owners, and of that extra 121, you'll see on the right the different connections that people have to agriculture. So people who own farmland or who grow up on farms or own businesses that rely on farms. So it gives you a sense of that breakdown. And then of the people who are farmers, about 86, 87% were dairy farmers. And again, just a little bit of a breakdown of who is answering the survey. Good to keep in mind as I'm talking about some of the results of who are these people. So the vast majority of the dairy farmers have really a small herd size, so more than half, less than 99. And you'll see that about half of the respondents were from Grant and Dane County. And as is reflective of the dairy industry, the respondents were also older and more likely to be men. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is some of the concerns that we saw in thinking about these changes in land use, and I'm going to talk about concerns related to land, community, and farm. So first, those related to land, and you'll see these quotes, a lot of them coming from the interviews. They kind of summarize some of the points that I want to talk about. This first quote is just reminding us that people see these changes around them, see the changes that have happened with their communities and in the farms around. So it's a total change of what it used to be. It was always a family-owned farm for generations. Of course, we hear that a fair amount. To summarize some of the points, the concerns regarding land use change, you'll see concern with outside investors buying land, with residential development, and with solar power generation, and that these things have a negative impact on agriculture. That's the opinion you'll see in a minute. And then I'll talk a little bit about also the concern of the effects on the environment of land consolidation. So this is a response to a question of what effect do these land uses have on agriculture in southern Wisconsin. And you'll see the biggest concern was about outside investors buying land at 90%. Some of that may be related to that word outside, because outsiders buying land as opposed to your neighbors and people that you know, that may have influenced that 90%. And then you'll see about 80% thinking of residential development has a negative impact, and then the solar about 70%. So again, I think with those higher numbers, we can register those as concerns. This quote helps us understand a little bit more about that concern with investors buying agricultural land. In addition to that word outsiders, so he says the farmers out here, and most of them, aren't trying to get rich. They're just trying to make an honest, good living. Where at the end of the day, you can go out and buy a beer. And I'm almost thinking it might be too late for a lot of this, all this discussion about changes in agriculture, because with these investors, you've got many investors groups coming in now and buying land because they can buy land and get a better return on their money than if they were putting it in the stock or the banks or whatever. And that's the killer right there to the family farm. That's forcing the land prices up. So another explanation as to why there's that concern with investors. And here are the numbers about that. Is some of this land consolidation having an effect on the environment and the health of the land. So about 50% said that it was having a negative effect. Okay, so community. This quote is from a business owner who really wants the market to be deciding the future of agriculture, but also wants us to pay attention to what are the effects of these changes on communities, and said, well, look at the social side of it. It's kind of like, what a shame. So when we talked to interviewees, they tended to talk a fair amount about what life was like when they were growing up, and how there's fewer people in the schools who are in agriculture, and decline in the schools in general, and some of the communities getting smaller. So we heard that a fair amount. And you'll see the survey result about some concern about the decline of the sense of community, and more strongly recognizing changes in the rural landscape. So this is asking about, have you seen these changes in your community? So if we had asked, have you seen these changes in society, we probably would have gotten a little bit higher. But the loss of the sense of community in their region, about 50% said that they see that in their community, and decline in religious and family values, also a little bit more than 50%, and again, a little bit higher for the landscape changes. And this quote is showing us the degree to which there is both, as we see with a lot of rural areas, people feeling a sense of connection, but then also an awareness of some division. Our town is a pretty tight-knit group of people, but when it comes to the farming community, they're so extremely competitive. So, We've got farmers that want to buy or rent more land. They've always got their head looking over their shoulder at maybe their fellow neighbor, wondering, what's he doing, you know? Why is that neighbor is over talking with him? But I know that our farming community, we would step in to help one another, our fellow farmers, in a heartbeat, and not even charge them for it or anything. Farmers are pretty notorious for sticking together under dire circumstances. Okay, so concerns regarding the farm. As you can imagine, when we asked people to tell us about their connection to the farm, it often started something like this. It's a long story, and so that's something we want to keep in mind, that when people talk about land and talk about farm and talk about family, it's generational, both in looking back and in looking forward. And we will see there is a commitment to maintaining connections to the land, often because of this family history. And I'll start out also by noting this chicken and egg approach to farm adaptation and the next generation. That is, in order for the next generation to take over the farm, there needs to be an investment in it. But the investment, families don't want to have that go in place if there's not going to be another generation to take it up either. And with this quote, we see how both of these things are playing out, even in one quote of trying to balance that chicken and egg problem. The next generation, I think, is starting to realize that they want back on the farm. But to do that, they need to be consolidated and have a large number to be able to put pencil to paper to make it really flow. Yes, I'm sad to see the exit of many small farms, but largely I don't think it's because of the industry itself. I think it's because there's no one there to step in. You know, there's no son or grandson to take over the farm. So a little bit of both. And this is showing us that connection between land and family. I can't read the small print there, but I know the ones on the far right are talking more about their own family and would they be hesitant to sell the land because of a long family connection to the land. And you can see it's around 66% that say that. And then the ones farther to the left are more just generally asking about, is this a family decision or a business decision? So you see it a little bit less likely to agree if it's just in general, should it be about business or family, but still there is an emphasis on the role of family in there as well. So now I've just talked about some of those concerns that we see documented in both the interviews and in the surveys. I wanted to talk about some of the complexities behind that. So for example, what is the role of political ideology and resistance to the government, or what should be the role of the government? How might that be affecting some of responses to concerns? So some of this will not be surprising, I'm sure, that there is a distrust of the government programs being able to solve problems. So we asked this tricky question. We have a few of these where we did not give people lots of choices, but just gave them a couple choices. If you had to choose, which of the following best preserves farmland and farming? So you can see 75% chose farmer ingenuity and work ethic above government programs. And that also links to what we heard some in interviews, and we see here this comment on the survey. Keep the government out and let farmers make their own decisions. Overall, they're very smart, and they know they know the land and how to keep it sustainable. Again, this will be difficult to see, but the first two things are pointing at the bottom, that there is a difference in how people responded to this by their political ideology and by gender. And this is one that I'll talk a little bit about more, that the smaller farm sizes based on herd were more likely to be resistant to government programs. So I see I have 5 minutes left, so I'll try to, again, speed through some of this. So even though, as I just said, that there is a resistance to government and maybe not the faith that the government is going to solve all of the problem, I also want to document that there is also acceptance and openness to programs that people can see there is a good positive effect, if they're effective, if they're financially, if they make sense, if they're feasible. And as this quote says, I don't like laws and regulations, but if they're out there, at least you follow it. So if the program is put into practice in a way that is effective as well. And we can see, again, smaller dairy farms are less likely to feel that government is helping. And again, I want us to think about what is the significance of that. Are there ways in which programs are more helpful for the larger farms? I won't spend too much time on this, but here are some specific policies that we asked about whether they supported them or not. And again, with the idea that there's a lot of resistance to government. There's more people that are supportive of these programs than are resisting them, and especially if we pay attention to the blue do not support, that's fairly low, 13%, 11%, 20%. So there is some support for some programs. This quote is helping us understand, again, if somebody sees the benefit of it, then they're more likely to be supportive of this. So this dairy farmer said, a lot of farmers don't like spending money and then not seeing the returns. Like I spent $60,000 on crop insurance premiums here for 2020, 21, 2020. And that kind of leaves a bad taste in your mouth, but I've been on the other end where it's like, oh my gosh, if I didn't have this back in '09, I had $15 milk and it went to $9. That was, put a real hurt on a lot of producers. I'll skip that one. And again, we can look at herd size and how that affects people's response to government programs. And this question was just more generally asking if are government programs helping? And again, you can see that they're more likely to be positive with the larger herd sizes. And we also see political ideology and age affecting that sense of community. Political ideology affected whether people saw a decline in the sense of community. Whoops. I want to make sure to say this one. If we're talking about perceptions of loss of a sense of community, I also want to draw attention to the significance of age with this. So people who are older than 60 are more likely to say that there's a decline in sense of community in their community. And this, of course, is related to generational change, but older people are also more likely to be isolated. And so these are the kinds of things I think we need to pay attention to as we're making decisions of who are the people that are going to be most affected by some of these changes. This is one of my last points. I want to say that as we're thinking of this connection to land, and the resistance to solar farms, resistance to residential development, we also need to pay attention to the ways in which people are dependent on these land use changes for retirement and for income. And we'll see also the significance of age and education and county. This is one where we gave them just a couple choices. Is it more important to keep the land in the family or keep that farming tradition in the family? There's more emphasis on land, just slightly, but again, especially paying attention to the significance of age with this. We can see that older people were more connected to the land, and that younger people, there's a larger percentage that were connected to the farming tradition. We'll skip this. And this helps us understand, this is again, there is that concern about solar farms, but people are also dependent on these sorts of land changes for their retirement and for income. So this is someone explaining why he was leasing his land to solar farms. I've struggled for 10 years to try to do something with our land, but you know what? The bulldozers never came, and we always thought the bulldozers were coming, and the bulldozers are going to pay off the debt. Well, the bulldozers never came, but the solar panels did, and the solar panels are going to pay off the debt. So, conclusions, just a little bit of summary of what I just talked about. Documenting some concerns about these land use changes. Dairy farmers are both skeptical of development and solar farms and dependent on them for income. Farmers are both resistant to government and appreciative of effective government programs. And policy responses to some of these changes should take into consideration some of the variables I talked about, like the role of farm size, age, education, and financial need. And this is all of us, and there was a group of students also who are very active in this program as research assistants and independent study scholars. And that's it. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much. Appreciate that a lot. We do have some time built in for questions. 3-4 minutes. We have questions from folks in the audience. Okay, over here. Sure. Small mic, big voice.
Okay, thanks. Judging by your last name, you should actually be a podiatrist, I think. My question is this. What do you attribute the predominance of Grant County as far as the size of the dairy economy there when looking at counties on the other side of the Wisconsin River like Crawford or Iowa? Why are those herd sizes in those counties so much smaller than in Grant? Is that just due to the fact that Grant County is so much larger? Thanks.
That's not a question that I think I could answer. It's not something that I was involved with my research at all. Okay. Yeah.
Okay, other questions over here? I saw you first, so go there, and then we'll come over to you.
Yeah, a couple of things. Very negative perception of government programs overall, but you were showing programs that were quite favorably viewed. Which programs were the thumbs down? And in terms of perceptions of older people, maybe they've been around longer and have more opportunity to see the change. I have gray hair, so I guess I fall in that category.
Yes, definitely. I mean, I think those two factors, as I mentioned, are help to explain different opinions of older populations, that generational shift, that they've seen a lot of changes over their lifetime, and then combined also with different life circumstances of people who are older. You have different sort of situations. And then what was your first question?
Yeah, the government programs,
Oh, yeah.
You showed effective ones they liked, but what didn't they like?
Okay, so there weren't any other ones that really stood, I'm trying to think now of other, we asked some about the COVID-19 money that came in. There wasn't negative around that. I think it is more just a general sense of resistance to government and skepticism about government regulation. So it was more that general idea. You know, some of it is connected to political ideology and just belief in the importance of small government. But there were some things that were interesting where political ideology wasn't as significant as farm size in some of those responses. So I think it's just a general distrust of government. Some of that smaller farm size might tell me that this is also linked to, as I mentioned, do people feel like they're not getting the help that they need, or maybe these are the farms that are struggling more, the ones that are more in decline, and so they're kind of just struggling in general. So of course you would feel like you're not getting the help that you need if you're really struggling, versus if you're doing really well financially or you're doing okay financially, things are working out, so you'd be less apt to be negative about that sort of thing. Yeah.
One more question over here. Go ahead.
Quick, two questions. First of all, did you extend or compare your literature to national data, or is Wisconsin any different than any of the other states? And the second question would be, given some of the contradictions within the opinions of the survey respondents, what would be the policy implications, or how could policy be crafted to respond to those contradictions?
Good question. So we're, as we focus, there's a lot of data that we're trying to work with, and as we focus on one or another, we do make comparisons to national contexts. There's nothing in particular that really stands out to me in terms of how this compares to other locations. And then, sorry, your second question again. How do the contradictions in the survey responses inform policy decisions? Yeah, so I would say with that, it's just instead of having a sense of what's happening in farming communities or what's happening to farmers generally, and trying to answer questions with that big group in mind, that we need to break it down more and think about what are the implications for small farms versus large farms, what are the implications for older people versus younger people, how are people who are just coming into agriculture now or just taking over the farm, what are their ideas, and so whatever policy is being crafted, making sure that this sort of data that's getting into some of those variations is informing that. Yes, I would be happy to. We are still working on trying to get this in a report form that will be online so that it will be. Mm-hmm. I'm glad to hear there's interest, and I should say that they're even doing the interviews and contacting people, we could feel that interest and people wanting to be involved and get more information out there. So it is good to have this motivating to make sure. I'd like to have it available on the Dairy Innovation Hub website so that and then try to get it out there to municipal leaders and whoever can access it that way. That's my thought.
Let's give an appreciation again to Claudine. Thanks so much. Really thank you for kicking that off. Thanks for the great questions from the audience. For those of you who don't already know me, I'm Chuck Nicholson, Jeremy's counterpart. I'm an agricultural economist. I work between animal and dairy science and the agricultural and applied economics departments here at UW-Madison. I also have the distinguished honor of being on the Madison Dairy Innovation Hub Steering Committee. We have a very important role in terms of thinking about the directions for the hub, evaluating research proposals, trying to support people interested in doing dairy-related research. And so I'm happy to be a part of that. It's my pleasure now to reintroduce my colleague, Jeremy Foltz. So he's already sort of talked a little bit about himself, so I will mostly just turn it over to him. But I will note that one of the things you'll note about this session is we have kind of a pretty good diversity of topics, all with a linkage to the growing farm businesses and communities area that the hub supports. This talk probably could have been in the previous session with Matt, because it has a lot to do with environmental, water quality type related issues. So Jeremy, thanks a lot.
All right. Thank you, Chuck. Okay, so I'm going to talk about climate change and water pollution, and in particular, thinking about the effects of extreme rainfall, or rainfall more than half an inch or an inch, on nutrient runoff in Wisconsin. So this is work jointly with Maren Skidmore, who through no fault of her own is at University of Illinois. She was my postdoc and funded by the Dairy Hub. And Tina Andaragi, who's at UMass Amherst, and all the good parts of the understanding water is all Tina's work, and most of the rest of the good parts are Maren's, but I'm up here presenting all this. Yeah, you know, all right, so we're going to be talking about non-point source pollution, which in the economics world is what we call agriculture. That basically, this is a national issue. When the point source pollution, that is factories and things where you can identify the single source, are regulated by the Clean Water Act. Some of agriculture is also regulated by the Clean Water Act. And we've made huge strides on point source. And non-point is where all of the future action in regulating nutrient pollution is likely to be. So we're thinking here about, well, what's the relationship between climate change, where we're going to see more variability and particularly more extreme events, and non-point source pollution. In this case, we're looking at runoff from a dairy farm in the spring when there's a snow melt, and this, if you know anything about it, is when you are likely to see large bits of runoff. So this non-point is a national problem, all across, particularly across the upper Midwest, but in Oregon and Pennsylvania, and it's of course an issue here in Wisconsin. We have lots of dairy farms. We have issues with polluted drinking water. Lots of arguments about how to regulate farms or these non-point sources, and who gets to do the regulation. This work, by the way, is sort of a follow-on of work that we did looking at local county level regulation of local county level manure ordinances, and where we found some effects of some of these local things. And so here we're looking at and so within the world of agriculture and water quality, the non-point source pollution is notoriously hard to measure, identify, and actually make improvements on. There's been a burgeoning literature on the effects of agriculture and water quality within the economics of environmental regulation. So there's work showing that by Raff and Meyer looking at Wisconsin, where animal agriculture worsens water quality. Crop agriculture overall tends to have worse effects on water quality. And there's some major unanswered questions, particularly about things like farm scale, which came up in the last presentation, and those effects on water quality. And policies in this realm have had mixed effects. So our previous work showed that some local regulations, particularly requiring nutrient management plans and some of the Silurian bedrock rules along the Lake Michigan edge, can have major effects on improvements on water quality. But across the nation, and there's a lot of other things we studied that don't seem to have at least a short-term effect. And across the nation, there's a sense that not everything is effective. And some of that is because, as actually we heard in the previous session, there are these legacy nutrients too that actually are sitting in the soil and don't really respond well to policy in the same way that maybe, not always that humans respond well to policy, but the legacy nutrients are even harder. And we'll see, I'll show you in this talk that is actually a major issue. So part of this is that climate change could maybe make this problem much worse. So there's a fairly large literature that has shown the effects of extreme rainfall events using kind of edge of the field measures. So the earlier session today was very much looking at, okay, what happens at the edge of a field or in sort of smaller micro watershed. We're going to look at the whole state and all the watersheds of the state of Wisconsin. And so that's kind of what we're doing here, is just expanding from an edge of the field look to a statewide look. And in the world of economics, when we do that, people say, well, why are you looking at Wisconsin? You should do the whole nation or the whole upper Mississippi. But this is what we're here doing today. So those edge of the field things, say irrigation, snowmelt, this increased rainfall is going to increase nutrient transport into the water. The state of Wisconsin is predicted to have increased heavy rainfall and flooding. So that's predicted to have increased effects on runoff. So that's what we're going to look at. All right. So we're going to be thinking about the effects of heavy rainfall on surface water nutrient concentrations. We're ignoring groundwater, which is a whole nother can of worms. And what I'll show is that we can replicate a lot of, at the statewide level, a lot of the kind of edge of the field studies. And the other thing is we're going to look at different land use. So the farm size, use of cover crops, and try to get a sense of the role of legacy nutrients in this operation. And we're going to show that some of those things matter, and we can quantify a number of those effects and the scale of them. So our outcome is the filtered ammonia and total phosphorus concentrations, which we get from the water quality portal. There are water quality monitoring stations all over the U.S., and that data is available. We're going to have precipitation and temperature. We're going to pay basically no attention to temperature other than it's in our regressions there. It turns out not to matter much, which is why we're not paying attention to it. Our land use, we have addresses of all the dairy farms in the state. We also know which ones are CAFOs, so more than 1,000 animal units. And we have crop production data, cover crop data, and we're also going to control for the point sources because we're just measuring say phosphorus. You want to control for the fact that there's a paper mill upstream that might also be a source of phosphorus. When you look at this over essentially a 13-year period from 2007 to 2020. Okay, so a little bit on the summary statistics, and just to make it confusing, our rainfall data there is in centimeters, and then we do the more than half an inch, more than an inch. So, you know, go back to 4th grade and think about what the correct conversion is. So this is sort of at all of the watersheds. We're measuring those watersheds at a Huck 8 level. I'll show you what that means in a picture, because otherwise, if you're not deep into that literature, you wouldn't know what that is. This is where you can see it. So this is across Wisconsin. Each of the different zones marked out here is a watershed, a Huck 8. And these are the days with more than an inch of rainfall. And what's actually important for us to be able to identify these effects, there's a lot of change. So in 2011, in this southern Wisconsin Huck 8 watershed, you have a lot of days with a lot of rainfall. If you look at the previous year, there were a lot fewer extreme rainfall events. So there's a lot of variation. And in 2010, you basically have lots of very rainy days all across the state. These are where the dairy farms are. We're using the 2010 data, so don't use this as like, oh wait, that's the dairy farm near me, because it was only if it was there in 2010. The blue dots are CAFOs, and the red dots are the rest of the farms. Okay, so we're going to be estimating an econometric model where our outcome is the log concentrations in milligrams of either phosphorus or ammonia. Ooh, I got 5 minutes. Okay, and we're going to be using extreme rainfall is the thing that we're interested in measuring. We're going to be measuring that as more than half an inch or more than 1 inch. And we have a bunch of fixed effects and various things that the few economists in the room would definitely care about, and the rest of you are like, hey, I'm not sure what that is. Okay, now I'm going to show you some numbers that are too small for you to read, but the important thing, these are different scales of rainfall, 0 to 1 inch, 1 to 2 inches, more than 2 inches, and then the lags from the 1-day lags of this. And basically all of these extreme rainfall events produce excess runoff of on an order, if you look at the log column, it can be as much as 40 to 50% increases in the concentrations of both ammonia and phosphorus. Here's what it looks like by month. So we start our year in March. But basically what you see is higher rates in the spring runoff, and also some high rates when you get rainfall in the winter. So the things that are sort of both to be predicted, makes us feel good about our results. Okay, so we're looking at the activities here, and this is, I think, a couple of the more important things we found. So we look at how extreme rainfall is affected by the number of dairy farms overall and the number of CAFOs. And if you look at these numbers, the non-CAFO farms have a smaller coefficient than the CAFO farms. And so you might say, okay, that means that CAFOs are less environmentally friendly, there's more runoff there. But if you do the math and you say, on average, there are about 20 times the number of cows on those CAFO farms, it turns out that the runoff per cow from a CAFO farm is less than half of that from a non-CAFO farm. So if you're thinking about how you would want to structure your landscape for the least amount of runoff, you would want more of your cows on these CAFO farms, which are more heavily regulated. So the CAFO farms have to obey the Clean Water Act, which means that they have to have manure storage that can deal with a 100-year flood. Our 1-inch extreme rainfall is not a 100-year flood. We also measure the amount of cover cropping, and we heard earlier this morning that cover cropping shows a lot of promise, and it also shows a lot of promise for reducing runoff of nutrients. And so at the scale of the whole state, it's also quite promising. That's the other thing. Oh, we also test this at end of the year, and which shows that these effects continue across the whole year. It's not just we get a spike the next day. It's that those spikes, those extreme rainfall events that we get over the course of the year have an effect on water quality at the end of the year. There are a bunch of other specifications. Let me just get to some conclusions. So what we find at the level of the state of Wisconsin is what you find also at the field level. So that's, I don't know whether that's encouraging or bad. What we see is that ammonia and phosphorus can spike after an inch of rainfall. And it's much higher in places with agricultural activity, as you would expect. Cover crops can significantly reduce this, an 18% reduction in phosphorus and 14% in ammonia. But cover crops is about 4% of the row cropped acreage, so there's a lot of room. That's the 1,000,000 acre challenge. So you get the 1,000,000 acres, and that's a lot of reduction in runoff. Also, farm size matters here, and regulation matters. So having more cows on more heavily regulated farms turns out to reduce runoff. It's maybe not surprising. Another thing that wasn't able to point out too much is that when we measure all of these things going on in the watershed today, there's about 50% of the runoff that is left unaccounted for. And that's your legacy nutrients. And that makes this regulation problem really, really difficult. Because you could do all the best regulations, stop all of the runoff from the farms, and there's still 50% of the runoff that is something that you could not necessarily blame on a farmer or regulate out of a farm. So there's a lot to be done with legacy nutrients and a lot of thinking that I think has yet to be done. And I guess I'd end with this idea that the strong regulations that we see actually may make these farms more environmentally friendly.
Okay, let's give Jeremy a round of applause for that. Some good, stimulating conversation. Questions from folks that we can take. Yes, right over here. There's no quota on questions, by the way. I want you to know. Okay.
I'll keep that in mind. Thanks. Yeah, I was just curious, would you consider arsenic to be an example of a legacy nutrient? I understand that. I think it's some parts of central Wisconsin where it just occurs naturally. Thanks.
If it occurs naturally, no, I think we wouldn't be thinking of it so much as but we did not measure that. It is probably in the data that we've used, but I have not looked at it, so I know nothing.
Okay, other question back over here.
Yeah, I'm sorry if I missed it, but when you were talking about coefficients, are those regression coefficients, or what were you describing?
Yes, these are regression coefficients. If I talked about an effect, it was because it was statistically significant.
Okay. The other thing I was wondering, you mentioned, land and crops. Do you take into account shifts in the types of crops that are grown on land? Because over the years, people have shifted from perennial forages like alfalfa to corn silage, a lot of soybeans, and corn silage soybeans are not so good in terms of runoff characteristics.
So we have looked at that, and actually, surprisingly, we expected to find an effect there. And so we played around with, we should measure it this way, or we should measure it this way, or make sure we're accounting for these, and that doesn't really change our main coefficients, which I think we're most interested in, which is related to what happens to the dairy farm activity. And we're mostly using those we need to control for the level of other activities going on. I think one could dive more into that, but actually I'm not sure that that turns out to be as important as the spreading of manure, I think.
Yeah. Other questions from folks? Now, I'll throw one more at you then. So what are the implications, the economic implications of the findings from your study? You touched a little bit on regulation, and maybe it's better to have the more highly regulated farms have more cows. What does that really mean for kind of the fundamental economics of dairy in Wisconsin?
Well, regulation costs money. And having your manure storage be ready for a 100-year flood is quite expensive, particularly because in theory that 100-year flood shows up once every 100 years. So I think if you took this, what I said, to the extreme, I think you would have big investments that would be necessary on a lot of smaller dairy farms. I think you might find that a lot of those smaller dairy farms would say, well, maybe we'll just put in solar panels and stop milking cows, because it may not pay at that scale. I think that's a thing that is there for future research, and that I do think we need to think about it. Now, some of, I guess, our other work which looked at things like places where nutrient management plans were required of all dairy farmers had lower levels of runoff. So that's a simple, I mean, it's not low cost, but it's, you know, well, in theory, it depends who you talk to. Like, I think soil scientists would say it's win-win. You know, you earn some money because you save on nutrients, and most farmers I talk to say, oh, it's just a regulation that, you know, we pay some consultant, and it just costs money. But there are some low-cost things that I think can be done.
Okay, thank you much. Let's give Jeremy a round of applause again. And strangely enough, I'm going to hand the microphone to Jeremy, and I'm going to take this other microphone over to Kevin.
All right. So now I put on a different hat and and introduce our next speaker, who is Kevin Bernhardt from UW Platteville, otherwise known as the Harvard of Southwest Wisconsin. He paid me to say that. Actually, Chuck paid me to say that. He's a professor of agribusiness and farm management, and a farm management specialist with UW Division of Extension. His scholarly interests include farm financial analysis and management, risk management, commodity marketing. Welcome, Kevin.
Testing, there we go. Okay, thanks. The presentation I'm going to be giving here is on cost of production. So we have a group of us, Chuck being our fearless leader in this, which, you know, I had to hurry up and get these into Maria, so I didn't get a chance to get everybody else's names up there. I only got mine up there. But Chuck Nicholson and Luis up in River Falls and myself, and once in a while we even drag Mark out of retirement to come and help us with some things as well. But we're looking at getting our arms around cost of production. And this is not a new topic, and it's certainly not new to the literature. It's not new to the kind of farm management work that's been going on for years. I was talking to somebody else today at lunch that my father was an extension agent, county extension agent in Iowa way back in the day, and I think he dealt with the same things that I'm dealing with now. It hasn't changed much. The data that we're going to be looking at is from the Center for Dairy Profitability. Used to have a database called AGFA, and it was here for many, many years until 2018. It's no longer around. But the data is coming from the 5 years of 2014 to 2018. So there's 178 farms that are involved in that. All farms except for one has 5 full years of data. There's one farm that just has 4 years there. And I don't think I actually got to anything from the University of Minnesota, but they also have a FinBin database there, and I occasionally go there and look at some stuff as well. Let's meet the times of this, 2014 to 2018. If you recall, by the way, just a quick show of hands, how many people in here are producers? Do we have a couple producers? And how many are people who directly serve producers? A couple of those as well. And then academics, extension people are the rest, government? Yeah, okay. So those of you who were producers in particular, you look at that slide and you look at that red part there, you know, right in the middle. This is the 2014 through 2018. 2014 was a fun year, followed by 4 years of misery, right? So that's where this data set is at. So it was at, other than the very first year, the next 4 years were very unprofitable years, or challenged years, I would say, in the dairy industry. So that sort of makes cost of production a little bit more important when it comes to that. Now, you've commonly heard the economics statement that commodity producers, including dairy producers, milk producers, are price takers. That's true to a point. The base value that's paid out based on the standard component levels you're a price taker. Individual producer can't do anything about that. But they can do something about the premiums they get They can do something about the discounts that they don't have to suffer. They can do something about the extra value that they can get in their price for component values. So that does make price a little bit in that circle of control of the producer as well. And we'll see that here going forward. This slide is showing the average cost of production for all 178 farms for all 5 of those years. That's the red line that you see going here for 2014, 15, 16, et cetera. The dashed green line is the mailbox price for Wisconsin. So it's somewhat close to what the producer was actually receiving in their milk check. Now, you can see pretty quickly here that in 2014, that was a lot of green, but not so much after that. So it was a very challenged few years there for those 4 years. And we heard a lot of stories of during that time about the number of farms going out of business or deciding to quit, not necessarily being forced to quit, but making that decision to do so. The return on assets, first of all, let me introduce this. High third, middle third, and low third is taking that data set and splitting it by thirds in terms of return on assets. And it was the high third, middle third, low third group is based on the average return on assets for those 5 years for a single farm. And so there may have been a year where it wouldn't have been in the top. In fact, that's what Chuck's work is doing. There may have been a year or two out of those 5 where it wasn't in the top third, but on average it was. So that's the data for the high third, middle third, low third. This is the average, the big number. Oops, I guess I don't have a pointer here. This is the average. This is the average plus and minus a half a standard deviation, plus and minus a full standard deviation. So you can get a little bit of a feel for the range of the return on assets there. So the point there is even though 4 out of the 5 years were profitable, challenged years, the high third group of producers were still making money. And not bad. 5.4% return on assets during low price times, that's doing something. But let's look at that difference between the top third profitable producers and the low third profitable producers with respect to cost of production. So the overall average that you saw on the last slide, that's the middle red line in this graphic. The bottom line, the bottom bold black line, is the top profitable third producers. Much, much lower cost of production than what the bottom third had. And I think I got the numbers in. There it is per hundredweight. So you look at those numbers, and the class 3 during that time, well, I had the mailbox price in the last slide, but we were probably looking around $18, I suppose, something like that during those 4 years. $3, $4, that's a lot of cushion. That's a lot of shock absorber that those high profit group had that could absorb those low prices. Now, we didn't think much about this the last couple years until now. So what's happening with prices right now, right? We are dipping again. We are down low, probably will be for a little bit. And again, we have that shock absorber is needed by those farms. Again, looking at the top third, low third, with the dashed line being the mailbox price. That was the same, the scale's a little different, but that's the same green and red that you saw before in that previous slide for the overall producers. But here's what it is for the top third. So that top third had a lot more green going all the way out. They have green, 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 all the way into a little triangle here at the end where they actually didn't make money in 2018 either. High, middle third, low third profit group. This is the average over the 5 years. And you can see those differences. So that's taken all 5 years, not breaking it down year by year. And that top third, high third group, lots of green here for on average compared to that low third group. Okay, let's dig into the profit equation. Never want to get too far. I teach down at Platteville, and that's the first thing I write on the board in my farm management class, I think almost every other day. Don't ever forget where profits come from. So price minus the cost of production gives us our profit margin on a hundredweight basis, right? Times hundredweight sold. It's not a very difficult equation. In fact, it's quite simple, quite straightforward. But we have to be careful when we're looking at cost of production, because we tend to, when you think of cost of production, which one? Cost per cow, cost per hundredweight, total cost for the farm, cash cost of production, accrual cost of production per cow, per hundredweight, which one? So just in that one instance here, cost of production per hundredweight, remember what that is. That's cost of production per cow divided by how much production we have. So early on when I was looking at, okay, what's the importance? In fact, some of this data was presented last year up in River Falls. A lot of that just looked at the cost of production per hundredweight, but you're missing out on a big part of the story. You have to really look at that numerator and denominator there. So what does it say in this database about the top third, middle third, and low third? Profit per cow, you see those numbers up there, a lot higher for the top third as you would expect, a lot lower for the low third, but where is it coming from? Price, and the numbers, these are the average prices that each group got. This is how much difference there was from the overall average. So that's what that number is. So the top third group got 74 cents more per hundredweight than what the overall average was. The low third group got 58 cents less. Doesn't seem like a lot, but you take that out over the number of hundredweights that are produced in a farm, it starts to add up. So price made a difference. Cost of production per cow made a difference as well. So I'm going to bring up the last one up here as well. So what this, if I could take all that bunch of numbers, you're not supposed to put this many numbers on a slide, right? So let me break that down for you here a little bit. What I saw in this is to get from the low to the middle third, I had to cut cost of production per cow. So I pinched here, I pinched there, I used a cheaper feed stuff. I didn't hire that last laborer. I did maybe cheated a little bit on cow comfort. I did everything I could to really whittle down that cost of production per cow, the total cost that I'm paying. That's how I got from low third to average. But I suffered a little bit in the production by doing that. How did I get from middle third to the top third most profitable producer? I spent money. Now that sounds counterintuitive, but I spent money wisely. So I spent money for things that returned greater profits than the interest that I was paying for it. And I converted those extra costs into extra pounds per cow. That's where the difference came in. So think about that numerator and denominator of cost of production. The high profit third group here had a higher cost of production per cow. But they also had a lot more production per cow. Did I say that right? Higher cost per cow, sorry. But they also had a higher production per cow. So when I take the ratio of the two, it turned out to be a benefit in terms of cost of production per hundredweight. So I found that kind of interesting. A little bit different way that we slice this. I had a student that was helping me with this down in Platteville. A little different way we slice this. Middle group compared to the low profit group, they actually had more labor, more cost for labor. They paid less for machinery, less for depreciation, a little bit less in most all categories. Remember that middle group? They got there by having cutting their cost of production per cow. Cost per cow. Cost per cow. Plus they got just a little bit more production than the low third group did. As I go from the middle group to the high profit group, significantly more labor. That was interesting, especially in our times. Now remember, this data set was 2014 to 2018. What's happened since 2018? Well, we had this little thing called a pandemic, kind of caused a little disruption, right? Certainly caused disruption in labor. Labor was a challenge before. It's even more of a challenge now. I'm looking at our producer we have here. A lot more challenge today. But for that 5-year period, significantly more was paid for labor, more was paid for purchased feed, and more was paid for vet costs, vet and med costs, compared to all the other groups. Now, if those are managed, if purchased feed and vet and med cost and the labor is all managed well, that converts to pounds per cow production. And that's where they got it at. Less in most agronomic areas, so they tended to be less there. They were more cow people. Plus, they got more production and a higher price. Relative impact, that's how much came from price for each group, positive and negative. That's how much came from cost of production per cow. The high group, you don't see an orange thing because it was the same as what the overall group was. And that's how much came from extra production per cow. So in terms of relative, where did that profit come from? Another thing that was different was fixed versus variable costs. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but note the variable cost doesn't change much. In fact, it's only 2 cents difference between the high group and the low group in terms of variable cost, but the fixed costs change greatly. So when you get in a time of tight profit margins, like 4 out of those 5 years were, you can't change your fixed costs very much. It's not easy to do that, but you can change your variable costs. And so we might be seeing that effect there as well. My time is running out, but I just wanted to quickly show, we're trying to do a little regression work here. My career has not involved a lot of econometrics over the years, so this has been kind of fun to try to learn all this again. This is a fixed effects model. It's kind of what Jeremy showed here a little bit ago. And so that's what we're playing around here with. Let me get to the results. I looked at 3 different models, one of them where I didn't do any transformations at all. And my dependent variable was return on assets and a variety of independent variables that I'll show you in a second. Second model, I had dummy variables for year. And in the third model, it was a demeaning model where we took effects out for both year and by farm. That's too busy. I will show you this. These are the things that were significant. Price, these are the 3 different models. And what I'm showing you here is all the variables that were significant, and these were the coefficients on them. So in other words, for the first model, and I converted these into the absolute changes as well. So how much did price add to return on assets? About 0.75, almost 3/4 of a point on return on assets, etc. Now you look down through that list. Extra cost per cow, of course, was negative for all 3 groups. Production per cow was positive. Debt per cow was a significant variable, and depreciation. So depreciation per cow is a capitalization variable. How much bright, shiny paint, so to speak, is out there on that farm? And are they using it and converting it into production per cow? If you look through that list real quickly, look down each column real quickly, there's one variable that stands out. This odd thing, return on equity being greater than return on assets, had a big impact on what the what the return on assets was. That particular variable is a dirty way to try to get to how is that farm being managed? How is the debt being managed on that farm? If return on equity is greater than return on assets, that means that debt is being used to finance stuff that is returning a greater profit than the interest paid for it. And the extra goes into your pocket. So those most profitable producers had way more often than not had a return on equity greater than return on assets. They were using that debt to finance things that end up making them money. It's not that they had less debt. It was how they used the debt that made a difference. This could have a lot of implications right now, because when these farmers are going back to refinance their debt, you see you're shaking your head, yes. When these farmers are coming back to refinance their debt now, what are they doing with that interest rate? 4, 4.5, maybe even 5, up higher yet, greater. Now, That means you have to make up that much more to get to that positive return on assets. So we could be heading into a period that we haven't faced in a long, long time in agriculture, and that is high interest rates. I think my time is done. I didn't have much more to show there. Well, there it is. There's the thank you. So, yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. Let's give Kevin a round of applause for that. Appreciate it. I imagine both dairy producers and non-dairy producers in the room may have some questions for Kevin, so happy to have those. Sure.
So in telling us who each of the three groups, or you told us what they did, but were there any factors that correlated with who they are? Because
In terms of
data
the,
seems to suggest that the top third were very large producers.
yeah, there was, I don't think I showed the descriptive statistics on that, but I'm going off of memory here. I think the high third group had an average herd size of 400 plus average per cow. And it was less for the middle group and the least for the bottom third group. I didn't show them here, but we've done, last year at this time, we presented several statistics on herd size. And what you find is that on average, the higher the herd size, the more return on asset profitability there was. But there is a good range within each one.
That was kind of my follow-up question.
Yep.
Were there smaller producers who could be in the top?
Yes, yes, yes. It was a challenge, though. During those 5 years, at least, it was hard to get the smallest size producers. There wasn't very many of them that were in the high third. By the same token, there wasn't very many of the largest producers that were in the low third. But there was a range. There was some there, yeah.
Great.
The hardest group, by the way, was it was less than 99, 100 to 99, 200 to something. The 100 to 199 group was the toughest group for profitability. I think that's probably not a surprise. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. On the table with the variance explained, or can you help me the interpretation? So when you have so this is like you said adjusted, so 0.95, 0.75 there,
Yeah.
and then how you interpreting the log scale then?
The actual coefficient on the log scale would be the percent change. But I took that percent and multiplied it by what was the minimum return on asset for the overall database. So to try to get a number that was comparable to when I didn't have a transformation. So the interpretation of this would be the same. So based on this model, Price had a 0.75% difference on return on assets. Based on these two models, it was a little bit more. Yeah.
So what was the driver in the price differential for milk that the different groups got? Like the high third group got a higher price for milk. I mean, what was that due to?
I didn't have it in the database, didn't have a breakdown of premiums, but it would have to come from quality premiums, quantity premiums, and component values would probably be the biggest three.
So I'll show my ignorance in this. I mean, do prices farmers get vary within the state? Depending
Yes.
on where you are, what plant you ship it to, and so, I mean, is that a
Yep.
factor too?
Yep.
Just happen to be where you are?
Yep. It all starts with a base price. It's called the class 3 price, based on certain component values, certain amount of butterfat, protein, et cetera. I don't remember what the percentages are now, but whatever it is, it's a base price. Every farmer gets that, and then it goes up or down from there based on quality premiums, quantity premiums, other premiums or differentials that might happen because of the buyer of your milk, the area that you're in, and component values. So I think was it 3.5% for butterfat? And so if you have more than that, you get extra pay for that amount. Am I catching most of those different premiums and discounts that you would get? Ah, okay. We'll really put you on the spot now.
Yeah, it's going to vary on who you're shipping your milk to, because you could have, and it gets into the real weeds if you're talking about minimum prices and federal orders and all
Yeah,
that kind of
yeah.
stuff. That, a handler would have to pay a minimum price to their members, which can be different if you're shipping to a cooperative than a proprietary plant. But if you're not part of having to pay the minimum prices, you can pay what, as I have to tell some of our farmers, members, they just have to pay enough to get milk in the door. And that's kind of why we're working on some of the other things. If you ship your milk to a cooperative, makes it may be different, but for my cooperative, we just had to do our final pay price, and that's my director of marketing, my accounting guy, and me. And we just look at, here's what we sold milk for. We don't process anything, but we sell to about 20, 25 different plants, and we see how much money we got, and how much we can
Split it
get back
out.
up to, and split
Yeah.
out amongst
Yeah.
the members,
Yeah.
and take a look at the bottom line of the cooperative as to what we need to do. So
Yeah.
that's,
And the next cooperative in the next county will have a different situation.
and it could, and it's because,
Right.
well, in Wisconsin, we're very fortunate in the fact that we have lots of different buyers of milk. So yeah, depending upon where you're at and,
Sure.
and you're correct on the premiums. If for higher quality milk, low somatic cells, you can get a premium for that. There's different pickup premiums, different things that different companies have. If you're some of the plants that have more branded products, they have a lot more different incentives as well that you can make money on too. So.
Yeah. Does
Yeah,
that
actually,
answer your
thanks.
question? Yeah.
Yeah, just to kind of follow on that, we know from the data, we actually have the butterfat contents and the protein contents, which are key elements of that component payment. So one of the things we can tease out a little bit is what's going on with the other elements of that. Not perfect, but it gives us some opportunity to do that. And if I'm remembering right, we have a range of $3 to $4, sometimes even more, in the price paid across different farms. So that's partly, as Kevin said, components. It's all partly those other things. So there's a big range, right? So that's why price is still important. Okay, let's give Kevin a round of applause again here. And Luis, I'll be looking for you to come up here. So we're heading into the last of our presentations, and in keeping with kind of our theme of diversity, of having people from different kinds of departments with different kinds of names, we have Luiz Ferraretto, who's my colleague in animal and dairy sciences here. He is an extension specialist in ruminant nutrition here at UW-Madison. I think of him as kind of like the nutrition expert, the guy I'm going to go and ask questions of if I have a question about something like that. His research and his extension work are really focused on applied ruminant nutrition and management, and he's going to bring to bear some of those skills in his presentation today. So you're good with that over there? I'm going to hand you this over here, and take it away. Thanks.
There you go. Otherwise, it's impossible. So, well, first, thanks to the Dairy Innovation Hub team for having me. And
Those are my extras, so yeah.
can I keep going? Yeah, sounds good. So there you go. That's what I want to present, okay? So if you're waiting for me to talk a lot about anything related to how you make more money, I'm not your guy, okay? I'll try to, but I'm definitely not skilled enough for that. So the topic that we have for today, it's actually related to that, okay? We want to discuss a little bit about how do we feed for profits, but that's quite a challenging question because it involves a lot of different things that we have to consider. And my job today is actually tell you about some of those things that we have to consider, that those beyond the profit itself, right? Obviously, at the end of the day, that's what we want, okay? So from a dairy nutritionist perspective, when we try to define a diet and we try to define what are the best options that we have to improve dairy profitability, unfortunately, there are a lot of different things that play a major role into that effect. And here we have some of those key effects. Probably not all of them, but some of those factors that we have to consider. Okay? Today, I'll try to connect the top factor, okay, not top in ranking or order of importance, the one that you see on top of the slide, okay, forage feed quality, okay, and how that affects cow performance. And from there, try to calculate a little bit, why does it matter? But again, keep in mind that all those factors, they interact, and depending on how well or how poorly someone works with some of those other factors, it may affect the overall performance, okay? So today we will discuss one of those aspects associated with forage and feed quality, and that's fiber quality, okay? And the reason for that is, let's be honest, right? The dairy cow is quite unique because she has the opportunity to transform feeds that we cannot utilize into milk, which we can actually utilize, right? And primarily because she can digest forages, right? But if you think about the dairy cow, and nowadays cows may be consuming up to 60, 70 pounds of dry matter per day, okay, which is way more than some years ago. And depending on the diet, they may have about 15 pounds of that diet being forage fiber. But if you start going through the digestion process of that cow, it's actually not quite efficient. And I think that's very important because maybe that's the bottleneck that we have to focus for efficiency. So if you think from that perspective, that cow consuming 15 pounds of forage fiber, on average, literature average for research, okay, she probably digests 6 pounds of NDF. That's the metric that you use for fiber, okay? Neutral detergent fiber, the most common method used for that. But if you look to my standard deviation numbers there, some cows digest up to 9.5, some cows 1.5. And that's quite a variation, right? And there are a lot of different factors that play a major role in that. And we'll briefly touch on some of those factors, okay, but we won't be too extensive, I promise, okay? But why do we care about that? If you go through literature, you will see that 1 pound of digestible fiber very likely has potential to produce 3 pounds of milk. That's a lot of milk, okay? So it makes a lot of difference, okay? But it's not just fiber. There's a lot of other things associated with that. So just to understand this concept, let's go back a little bit and understand the importance about forage fiber, forage quality, okay? So if we go back about 20-some years into this Michigan State data from Oben Allen, and if we use laboratory assays as the example, they run a meta-analysis during the time that they even call that a meta-analysis, okay? Unfortunately, but it is a meta-analysis. And what they saw, it's quite fascinating because they realized that if you increase 1 percentage unit in vitro or in situ NDF digestibility, which are two of the assays that are available for us to evaluate forage quality, there is potential for a dairy cow to improve her intake by 0.4 pounds per day. And that translates very likely into 0.55 pounds more of fat-corrected milk. Right? So obviously there is an efficiency fact there as well, right? That is not reported. Some years later, Jung and collaborators, they run a similar exercise, but only with diets that had more than 40% corn silage, and they saw a similar response, right? So I believe at this point, we know very well that this is true, okay? There are many trials in the literature that suggest that as you improve forage fiber digestibility, there is greater intake, and because of the greater intake, there is greater milk production. But there are other components associated with that. Okay, so some years ago, we put together a review related to silage, and we tried to understand what are the effects of forage digestibility, not only on intake, but also of feeding behavior of dairy cows. Okay? So basically, we compiled these 4 studies, and the reason why we chose those is because they compare corn silage-based diets with sorghum silage-based diets. If you're familiar with both crops, you certainly know that sorghum is less digestible than corn. Okay, that's just how it is. I'm not trying to say sorghum is a bad thing. Okay, it's just how it is. So we wanted a clean comparison for this. So the way we are presenting data here is the percentage that the cows consuming the sorghum silage-based diet represent compared to the cows fed corn silage-based diet. So let's use the first row as an example, right? So in that study, cows consuming the sorghum silage-based diet only ate 88% of what the cows consuming the corn silage-based diet. And you can see that across all 4 studies, this was true, right? Cows ate between 85 and 95% of their cohorts consuming a more digestible diet. But you knew that, right? I just showed you on a slide saying exactly that. What we didn't know is those cows, they eat 85 to 95% of the other cows, but they spend 105 to 120% of their time at the feed bunk, right? It's very counterintuitive if you think about that. They spend more time at the feed bunk to eat less. Doesn't make any sense, right? It's like if you spend more time at breakfast and don't eat, right? That's what it is, right? So the question is, what is she doing, right? If I had to guess, I'll guess that it takes longer to masticate, and she's probably sorting, trying to get more digestible parts of that diet, okay? And I think that's quite important because, let's be honest, if she's spending more time at the feed bunk, where she's not at? She's not resting, right? There is one aspect that people often don't consider when formulating diets. The time the cows have to be resting and ruminating at the same time. And I think this shows part of this story, right? Not completely, but it fits their time budget. So because of that, we start trying to understand which factors affect eating time and consequently performance. And one of our previous data sets suggests that if you add more forage fiber to the diet, cows spend more time eating. And they often eat a little bit less, right? It's a normal response, right? I'm not saying feeding more forage is a bad thing. All I'm saying is feeding more forage leads to that. Actually, my goal today is to convince you that feeding more forage is better. Okay? I didn't start very well, obviously, right? But the reason why I'm showing that is it's not about feeding more forage. It's about feeding higher quality forage, and that's why we have those. Okay? Because of that, we had the opportunity to run a study kindly funded by the Dairy Innovation Hub, okay, where we wanted to understand the variation in consumption of undigested fiber by dairy cows. Undigested NDF is an assay that we use to access the indigestible portion of forages so we can better predict digestibility and formulate diets. Okay? I'm not going to be talking about this project today. Okay? Mateo's master student during that time, now PhD student, presented that during the last Dairy Summit. Okay? Today I'm going to show you a study that we conducted because of what we learned from this study. Okay? So after we realized that we need to feed more digestible fiber, more digestible forage fiber to dairy cows, we start thinking, well, what happens if we actually replace forage fiber with non-forage fiber sources that are actually more digestible, right? If you analyze soy hulls, you'll see that soy hulls have NDF digestibility that is much higher than corn silage, for example, okay? So in order to do that, we run a study where we were trying to understand what are the effects of replacing forage fiber with a non-forage fiber source. In this case, I'll show you the diet in a second. We tried to replace corn silage with soy hulls, okay? And we wanted to also understand how this changed feeding behavior, right? And our goal was to run that during the summer. So we also had this question, are there any implications for heat stress? But we ran that last year, okay, from mid-July. And as you probably remember, the summer was not too warm, right? So let's forget the heat stress for a moment because I'm not going to answer that question, okay? We tried to. I think there are implications, but we didn't accomplish that, okay? So to do that, we run this study in the Blaine Dairy Cattle Center, which is here in Arlington. It's the university herd. We use 64 multifarious hosting cows. Our cows usually start trial at that days in milk. That's what we work as a group primarily. So for this specific group of cows, they had 76 days in milk and approximately 700 kilograms of body weight at trial initiation. Okay. We have a very unique setup. You saw the pictures when I described the study I'm not presenting, okay, with all those blue feeders, right? Those are our gate feeders, Isentech feeders, okay? Basically, the cow it works with RFID, so it recognizes the cows that are allowed to enter into specific gates, okay? We have 32 of those gates in a pen that we can put 64 cows. So basically what we do is we divide 8 cows for each treatment. You see that we have 4 different treatments, okay? 16 cows per treatment. So each of those 16 cows can eat from any of those 8 gates. And we can collect all the data to know how much she ate, at what time she ate, and calculate all the different feeding behaviors, okay? In order to avoid bias related to the placing the pen, for every 8 gates, we have 2 gates for each of the 4 treatments. Okay, so we randomize within each of the 8 gates. We let cows 1 week in the pen to be fully acclimated to the pen and to the gates. And then after that, we go to 2 weeks of covariate where all 64 cows receive exactly the same diet. Okay? Why do we do that? We do that because we need to make sure that we have a baseline for those cows, right? Because sometimes you end up with groups that some cows have a little bit higher production and then they carry over that, right? So that's why we utilize that. So later we can utilize as a covariate in the model to make sure we adjust for those potential issues. And then after that, cows stay 8 weeks consuming their treatment diets. So basically we had 4 different treatments, 2 high forage diets and 2 low forage diets, and we tested a specific feed additive. I'm not going to discuss anything about the feed additive today. Okay, anticipate to you, we barely see anything for this specific study. Okay, most of our effects were related to the forage level in the diet. I actually think that's the best take-home message as well, so that's what we're going to go through with. So instead of having high minus high plus, we just have high. Instead of low minus low plus, we have low. These are the diets that we had. If we go through those ingredients, you'll see that basically we replace approximately 10% of corn silage, remove, right, from the diet, and we replace that with soy hulls, and we adjusted some of the other feeds in the diet because we didn't want to have any confounding factor of nutrients. So our goal was to just replace NDF from corn silage versus NDF from soy hulls. Okay? That's why we increased a little bit high moisture corn and a little bit of dry ground corn, so we would have exactly the same amount of starch. Okay? And our high moisture corn is quite digestible, so it does match well with corn silage starch. Okay? We also adjusted some of the other ingredients, so protein will be very similar. Okay? Here's the diet that we had. Before anybody asks me that, yes, crude protein is extremely high. No, I do not recommend you to feed the level, okay? We analyze forages. They change a little bit before they study. After the study is going, I don't change diets, okay? I think is another confounding factor, creates problems for us to understand. So keep that in mind. I think it's too high, but unfortunately it is what it is, right? Same for starch. I actually usually use a little bit less starch than that. 28 I think is a reasonable number, but usually we go a little bit lower than that, okay? But those are our numbers. Those are measured, okay? We collected TMRs throughout the entire study and we analyzed them. So that's exactly what was fed to dairy cows. And then when we move to performance, it happened exactly the way we thought, okay? Cows consuming the more digestible diet in this case the low forage diet, consume more. And we knew this would happen, right? And because of that, we had greater milk production, fluid milk production. Let's keep that very clear here, okay? But as you start going through those numbers, you see that fat concentration was really decreased, right? And as we calculate energy-corrected milk, there's no difference at all. Okay? So later when we calculate feed efficiency, we didn't have a statistically significant p-value, it was 0.12, but numerically was slightly higher for the high forage diet. Okay? So basically, I think what we saw from this lactation data is improving or increasing intake is not going to actually translate into greater performance when you are replacing forages with a non-forage fiber source. Especially because in this case, basically we move from 20% forage NDF to 16% forage NDF, which is probably a low number, probably in the border of what you should be feeding overall, right? For feeding behavior, I think that the data also supports some of our previous findings, okay? But overall, I think what I want to highlight here is that the cows consuming a low forage diet, actually they went to have meals more often. You can see their meal frequency there. So basically they had more meals per day than the high forage diet, right? And I think that's quite interesting to me because as we expected, the cows that have a higher forage diet, they have a greater meal length. Probably they take longer to eat, right? In our case, we didn't have sorting, okay? So it's not that they are sorting, but they definitely take more time to chew and swallow those feeds, so it's a normal behavior, okay? I told you I couldn't really test heat stress in our study, but Mateus and his colleagues collected all the information, okay, including respiration rate and rectal temperature for those cows. And you'll see that the difference is very, very minor, very likely not biologically meaningful in this case, okay? But I will present because I want to make a point after that, okay? So you can see that cows consuming the low forage diet, they had this slightly higher temperature. So my question is, or my comment, I guess, is perhaps if we actually had heat stress, maybe we would see an impact there. Okay, I don't know if this is true or not. It's pure speculation on my end. Don't take as my take-home message because I cannot say that, obviously, right? But it's something that we have to consider. And I think it makes sense, right? They just ate much more. It's expected that they produce a little bit more heat, right? And then, you know, I decided to show some numbers that actually people care about, right? Is it worth doing that or increasing or reducing corn silage in the diet compared to soy hulls? So we calculate the feed price. Obviously, the low forage diet was a little bit more expensive, right? It's supposed to. You were buying feed instead of producing a high quality feed, right? And based on consumption, you can see that the feed cost per cow per day is obviously greater for the low forage diet, right? This was expected, nothing special there. But when we start calculating milk revenue, because energy corrected milk was so similar between both treatments, actually no statistical difference, so they were exactly the same, right? You can see that income over feed costs are actually higher for the high forage diet, right? And I think that fits quite well with what many nutritionists do and say in the field, as well as what you're seeing from other trials and discussions, right? If you really want to have good profitability, there is a need to have higher forage diets, and it has to be very high quality forage, okay? We didn't test for high quality forages in this study, but if we start going through a lot of different studies that test that, the results actually suggest that. So in conclusion, forage fiber digestibility drive performance and modulate feeding behavior patterns of dairy cows. And more digestible fiber is the main driver to increase intake and is what allows us to establish high forage diets. But replacing forage fiber with non-forage fiber sources is very likely not a good option if your goal is just to increase intake, increase milk production, and consequently income over feed cost, because it actually reduces income over feed cost under those conditions. However, I had an interesting discussion earlier today about the importance of considering this when you have low forage inventories, right? So it's a good option when you have low forage inventories. You're probably going to lose a little bit of profitability there, but at that point, you do what you have to do, right? So please don't take as low forage diets have no space anywhere, because there are scenarios where we have to use them. Maybe there are diets that are actually profitable under those conditions, but it looks like high forage diets are the way to go. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Thank you, Luiz. So we have time for a couple of questions. I'm mindful we want to make sure bring it down for Jadrea's excellent talk at 4 p.m. But question over here, I'm going to bring you the mic over. You still got that. We are good to go.
Hey there. Now, cows can get kind of tricky. Is there any chance that they were gaming these RFID chips to get into each other's feed gates?
Yeah, that's a great question, and you are absolutely right. You know, cows are quite smart. You know, and if you want to learn something about a pen, put your worst cow there, and she'll teach you, right? So, I actually run research. Probably when was that? 2011 in grad school, using exactly the same system, and we used to do that a little bit different. Okay, we used to put 2 cows per gate. Okay, so we use gate as an experimental unit. That causes a lot of competition between cows, and they learn faster what they shouldn't be doing. Okay, so we changed that completely. That's part of the reason why we allowed them to access more gates, because even though the ratio is the same, it changes the dynamic, right? But that's not the only thing. Okay, we also have, if we go back, I think I have the picture there. We have a very high-level piece of technology. I think it would be quite hard to see here. But in between gates, you see that there is a small bar there. We added a lot of those to make it harder for cows to get right next to the gate, disturb and remove another cow, and enter fast enough. Because the gate takes about, I'm going to say 10 seconds to close or so. So if you get a very fast, very aggressive, very smart cow, she will find a way. But we check for individual intake daily. So if we have a cow with an absurd intake and another cow with a very low intake, it's pretty obvious what's going on, okay? So in addition to that, we also try to see if cows can eat anything from the top of the gate, okay? Some of them learn that they can do that. So we keep track of that to make sure that we don't have any issues associated with that. Whenever we have a cow that do that, we completely eliminate the cow from the data analysis after that, right? In this case, we didn't lose any cow. I think they like both diets, okay? So luckily we didn't have this issue, but we keep track on all of those, and you're absolutely right. It's very challenging, but other systems are as challenging, right? Tie stalls, you have to put boards right next to them because they also figure out ways. So yeah, we have to keep track of those for sure. So.
Great. One more question from my day? Yes, Jeremy up here.
I'm just wondering if this sort of change in diet might also be a change in the landscape in terms of, like, assuming everything that you've said is completely correct, and so what do you think would be, is there a concomitant change in what needs to be grown? Yeah, absolutely. I think it has to be a combination of factors, right? I'm showing you the dairy cow feeding perspective. But for everything we do in terms of forage quality, we have to consider, you know, a whole picture, a whole scenario there. And what it looks like is, when it comes to fiber digestibility, several options we have to improve fiber digestibility reduces a little bit of the yield per area that you have. So you have to create a balance based on those, right? Some of the suggestions that we have recently is some of those technologies that allow us to increase fiber digestibility of forages is actually should be better targeted towards fresh cows, high producing cows, and then you have other forages that are a little bit lower quality, right, but produce more per area that you can feed your mid-late lactation cows and make sure you have a balance between both, right? So that's how we see that, and obviously to increase forage concentration in the diet, this would be true as well. In our case, the high forage diet is actually not that high, right? You can see that is, I think was 55% of the diet, so it's a reasonable, actually an average diet for Wisconsin. So.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Let's give Luiz Ferraretto an applause here. I am going to try and wrap things up. I want to thank our presenters again for a really nice and diverse session. Now, you may be saying, gosh, that was a lot of very different kind of information from very different perspectives, and also dairy different perspectives, I guess. How does that all fit under the umbrella of growing farm businesses and communities? And I want to try and maybe help us think a little bit about that before we walk out the door, to sort of say, how are these things linked? What are we trying to do in this general area of the activities that are funded by the hub? So we actually have just been revising our statements here about what it is that these different areas of the hub, the 4 sessions that we had today across the morning and the afternoon, what are we trying to do? And in this particular area, we have some goals that are focused on improving the profitability and the opportunities for growth throughout what I call the dairy value chain. We give a lot of emphasis, appropriately so, to farms here in the state of Wisconsin, but there are input suppliers, processors, retailers that are also important. And we saw some nice presentations from Luis, and particularly from Kevin, that focused on that farm level profitability idea, or maybe per cow idea, but also promote informed decision making by consumers and policymakers. And both Claudine's study, which got a pretty good response from folks about the importance of that information, and Jeremy's study, thinking about what the likely future is of runoff and environmental outcomes, how do we make decisions to make those things better? So it's part of trying to provide an information base to allow us to do that. One other thing that we're trying to do with growing farm businesses and communities is actually link to all 3 other areas of the hub to add value to the work that they are doing. And in particular, we can add value by assessing the economic and business implications of their research findings. So you heard me kind of push on Matt a little bit about, okay, so great, you can do these cover crops. What's the bottom line numbers on that? What do we know about how that plays out within a particular farm, and what the business case would be for that farm to do that? So we're trying to add value in that way. So I want to close by sort of saying that we're trying to understand a broad range of social, economic, and environmental implications of the knowledge that's being generated by all this great work that's being done here under the Dairy Innovation Hub, recognizing that those things are part and parcel. They're really important to understanding how we can best support people using that knowledge to improve the outcomes that the hub is intending to improve. And the last thing I'll leave, particularly for those of you who are UW faculty, and that's UW broadly construed, not just Madison here, but we're really inviting broader participation and collaboration across all the thematic areas of the hub to help us address the kinds of issues that social, economic, and environmental implications that we think are really important for the success of the hub and the most effective use of the information that's being generated throughout all the great work that's happening with the Dairy Hub. So I'm going to leave you with those thoughts about how I think the growing farm businesses and community fits within the hub activities, and also how we want to link with others. So thank you very much for being here this afternoon. I'm going to say, don't miss your outdoor areas talk downstairs. It's going to be great. So that's coming up at 4 downstairs. And thank you again for being here, and we'll see you downstairs. Thanks a lot. So, thank you again.
You're welcome.
That was really
Thank
nice. Glad you got a good, hey, that's really important kind of response. You got a really good, important response. Thanks, Destiny, for doing all the, you didn't have to make any mean faces. People were pretty good. That's great. Hey there.
Did you want to talk about anything else? As I was going to head out after this session.
We're good.
Okay.
Basically, I just want to say you have these different ideas. We have conversation in the summer.
Yeah.
Don't feel too pressured to actually start working on all of Luis's data analysis unless you're ready to do that. That's good.
Okay. That sounds good. Oh, awesome. Yeah, I'll be in touch before June. I've got to look at classes, but I think I'm going to do that after I get back. So.
You got that. Again, as a graduate student, there's what you have to do, and there's stuff you need to think about. You really don't have to make that decision unless you're worried you don't get in the class.
Okay. Yeah.
And that's generally not true with other ideas.
Okay. And would you recommend then going and sitting in on the first couple days of classes for the different
So
courses?
maybe as part of our conversation this summer, we can sort of look at what are some things that might be more common.
You got a big, huge food system, but it makes it rather quaint, you know.
We'll use our inside information, say, that professor's really hard, maybe you want to be careful about that one in the first semester, or, oh, that'd probably be pretty good, but once you sit in on it,
Yeah.
sometimes helps to get a syllabus from the current semester and kind of look at it and say, are they going to do the stuff I want to do?
And are we stuck on like our topic about profitability of automatic marking systems, or that guided flow, free flow? Is that something that would be an extra thing, or is that something that was just thrown out there? Or?
So we have flexibility,
Okay.
and so part of what I've been trying to do is, I'm not broadly familiar with all the research work that's been done on bodybuilding, like we probably know more about what's out there already, and the studies that are ongoing.
Yeah.
So part of the reason I think to take your first semester and kind of push more and just kind of get inside is with the coursework is to give yourself some time and give us some time to sort of say what's going to be the biggest thing that we should do in the 2 years that we're funded for. So I think that 3 years of guided flow study is probably something that we can do as long as Jeff's willing to say, yes, I give it a data.
Yeah.
There's, again, this other student that we hope to recruit to work on things that are kind of more like simulation modeling of farms. And kind of update that and extend it to be a little bit more relevant for Wisconsin.
Yeah.
There's the survey data that you already have collected.
Yeah.
The initial survey and then the more recent one. So there's a lot of different things that we could do. I think we can talk about it. Maybe there's a couple things we do. Maybe there's, like it's going to be 3 versus guided flow, but we'll flexibility to do that. The proposal basically says we're going to work on robotic monkey and it's going to be kind of this. But Jeff is also concerned about the profitability side of stuff, and I think there's some data that we might be able to use to help think about that. So regardless of how, I mean, those data sets don't have like the economic numbers in them, but if we start taking some external data and say, okay, so here's what we're talking about an average food cost,
They're trying to figure out how they can
that kind of stuff.
But so the kids can
Would you recommend me doing anything before graduate school? I am going to do the math camp. I got selected to be a Princess K finalist in